Welcome to this broadcast of the 2021-2022 World Language Webinar Series. My name is Anne Marie Gunter. I'm the World Languages Consultant at the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. This year, our webinar series is focused on the TEL learning experience. And particularly today, we're going to talk about the TEL, or Teacher Effectiveness for Language Learning framework, and look at the learning experience domain and specifically subcriteria LE3. This is part 2 of a 2-part broadcast, and so some of you may have joined us for part 1. So welcome back if that's the case, but all are welcome, as you know. Today's agenda is on the screen. We're going to start with a welcome and some introductions. Then we're going to have an overview of the TEL criteria and subcriteria that we're focusing on today. You see it on the screen. LE3 says, the teacher provides opportunities for students to process language in the interpretive mode. Remember, the interpretive mode of communication is our second standard in the World Language Essential Standards. After that, we'll have some reflections on implementing LE3 with our proficiency-based standards. And then we'll talk about evidence of LE3 characteristics and behaviors in K-12 World Language classrooms. We'll finish with a wrap-up and some reminders before you leave today. Let's go ahead and get into our welcome and introductions. To start with, we want to introduce you to your control panel and make sure you know how to use that to your advantage. In all WebEx events, and that's the platform we're using, you'll see a control panel very similar to what is displayed on the slide. Yours may look a little different depending upon what type of device you decide to join us with today or which browser you chose. But in general, you have all the features you see on the screen. Starting in the upper right corner, there's a video layout where you can see the slide that's being shown and that kind of thing. You can also choose a floating panel view, depending on how you want to view things. There in the center, you have your meeting controls. Those are hidden, of course, when you're not using them, but they reappear when you move your cursor over your screen. The ones that you need to be most concerned about are probably the little chat one that has a chat bubble there, kind of towards the right side of that. And then also the little X button, the red button on the far right, because that's the button you'll click on when you exit today and when we're through with our broadcast. If you accidentally hit it before then, don't worry. You can use the same link you used to get into the webinar to return if you need to. Also, the red button on the left is the little microphone button, and it's on mute for everyone. That's because we're recording this broadcast. All right, let's introduce you to our LE3 guest speakers. Some of you probably already know this particular series focuses on model world language teachers sharing their experience and expertise with us as guest speakers. These are world language teachers who've distinguished themselves by earning Teacher of the Year awards, for example, from FLANC, the Foreign Language Association of North Carolina, or NC Virtual, or those who have earned our statewide Global Educator Digital Badge, or GEDB. If you were here for part 1, you heard from Kristen Campbell. She was Teacher of the Year for FLANC for K-12 this year, 2021, and she's from Chapel Hill High School, and where she teaches French. I'm going to let our next guest speakers introduce themselves, but here are their slides. Alexa?
All right, so I'm Alexa Haselhorst. I was the Teacher of the Year with North Carolina Virtual in 2020, and I am the instructional lead teacher in French for North Carolina Virtual, and I teach French. Currently now I teach French 2 and 4, but yes, usually it's 1, 2, and 3.
Oh, very good. We'll update that on your slide. Great. Well, welcome. Next up is Carmen Scoggins. Carmen?
Hello, everyone. I just want to know who out there is super tired. I don't know if it feels like a Friday to me and it's Wednesday. So I just want to say a big shout out to Anne-Marie. Thanks for having me today. I look at that year. I was the 2007 Flying Teacher of the Year. I was like decades ago now, but and I teach Spanish at Watauga High School in beautiful Boone, North Carolina. I'm currently teaching levels 1 and 3. And I also teach at Appalachian State as an adjunct methodology instructor. And we finished our our last class of the semester last night. So that's one less thing I have to do now. So welcome everyone. And I'm excited to be here with you.
Great, thank you. And also, Thomas Soth is joining us today as a guest speaker. Thomas?
Thank you for having me here today. So I am in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I have the privilege of teaching with a rather big department, and I teach Spanish 4, AP Spanish Language, and AP Spanish Lit. So hopefully I get to learn a lot today and hopefully help some people out. So thank you.
Great. All right. Well, those are our 3 guest speakers for today. And now we want you to introduce yourself a little bit. We have a poll question. So again, on your control panel, you can look over at that. A poll question will be appearing. And we want to know what motivated you to participate in this webinar today. This is a check all that apply. Like any teacher, of course, we want to find out what is motivating our students, our learners. So is it to access professional development made for world languages? Is it to earn 1 contact hour for license renewal? Is it a follow-up on part 1 for this part of the series that you attended or watched already on November 3rd? Is it to gather information to share with others? Is it to learn about implementing our state standards from other world language teachers? Or did you want to find out more about state standards, resources, policies, and so forth? I'll go ahead and open that poll. And that should be visible in your control panel. You can just click on the answers that apply to you about what motivated you to be here today. We've got about 20 seconds left, and it looks like almost everyone has put in their answer. Go ahead and finish up giving your responses for this question. Great, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share the poll results with you so you can see what everyone said too. Looking across the board, people have multiple reasons for being here today, and that's great. The primary reason, 70% of you said you're here to access professional development made for world languages. And that's one of the main reasons we do this series, is to make sure there's something very particular for our world language teachers, focused on our world language essential standards. Also, over half of you said you're here to earn 1 contact hour for license renewal. It's always a good thing to do. Keep in mind, we want to stay professionally sharp. And so that 1 contact hour will actually come to you in the form of an email attachment in about a week or so. So keep on the lookout for that. The same number of folks that you're here to learn about implementing our state standards from other world language teachers. We are very fortunate this year that we get to hear from so many different model world language teachers, and including 3 today, which is great. There are also people here who were part of part 1 that joined us on November 3rd, so welcome back, and you want to get the second half of this. And people who said they want to gather information to share with colleagues. Please know that we will post all of the information you see shared today, these slides, the recording, any handouts and links that we use, so that you can use that to share with others, whether that's your team or your PLC, your professional learning community, maybe your department, your school, or even your whole district. You're always welcome to share what we do here. There's also people here to want to find out more about state standards, resources, policies, and so forth. And hopefully we'll share that information that you need. If not, always feel free to ask in the chat box and we can answer it there too. All right, let's go ahead and continue on. Our next question, which is part of you introducing yourself, is where are you joining us from today? In our virtual world that we've all become very accustomed to living in, of course, you could be joining us from anywhere. So I'm going to set up this next question and ask you, where are you joining us from today? If it's in North Carolina, which region is it in across the state? I've put them in order from western up to northeast. Or you might be joining us from someplace else in the U.S. besides North Carolina, or even outside of the U.S., someplace from around the globe. So let us know where you're joining us from today. Got about 15 seconds left. Be sure and get your note in there on the poll, your response. All right. Once again, I'll show the poll results. Oh, wow, we have almost every region covered today with attendees. We've got people from the Western region, the Northwest, the Southwest, the Piedmont Triad region, North Central, Southeast, and Northeast, as well as outside of North Carolina, but still here in the U.S. Great. Thanks so much for sharing where you're joining us from today. We're glad you're here. We hope we're going to share something with you that will help you in your classroom or with thinking about your curriculum and the work you do for world languages. Well, let's begin by having an overview of the TEL criteria we're talking about and the specific sub-criteria that we're focusing on today, LE3. This is focused on, of course, the interpretive mode of communication, and that's one of the critical components because that's one of the first things students start to notice in our classrooms is what they listen to, view, if you're an American Sign Language teacher, or what they read in your classroom in the target language that they're learning. Of course, the TEL criteria always support our North Carolina World Language Essential Standards, but specifically this criteria and its sub-criteria focuses on, as I said, interpretive communication standard number 2. You'll notice that here's sort of a screenshot of our standards and how they're organized. This is the weave graphic. You may have seen this before. This information is directly in our administrator guides. And so I'm going to put information about our administrator guides in the chat box for everyone. Our administrator guides are designed, as it says, for administrators to understand more about world language classrooms and what they should look and sound like when they walk into them. It begins with an overview of our state standards and how they're organized, as you can see with our 4 standards and our 3 strands that weave throughout each one. This is important because most administrators, particularly ones who are doing things like our classroom observations and our annual review, probably didn't come from a world language teaching background. And so they may not be familiar with what we do, particularly when we talk about proficiency-based standards and getting students to use the language in different ways. So I put the link to our administrator guides where they're posted on the website. If you would like to download the individual guides we have, you can certainly do that. I'm going to put those links as well in the chat box. We have administrator guides for classical languages like Latin. We have them for dual and heritage languages, like dual language immersion or native speakers courses. And then we have them for modern languages, which is where language is being taught as a separate subject. All of them begin, of course, with this overview of our state standards and how they're organized because we all use our state standards. That's one tool or resource with our standards that I hope you can use or maybe have been using with your administrators and with others to help them understand what our goals are when we teach a world language in North Carolina. Also, as we get started today, I want to make sure everyone has the handout, the Learning Experience Domain Criteria handout that we'll be referencing not only in this part of the series, but in some future broadcasts as well. The TEL Learning Experience Domain document was published in 2019, so it's not very old. It's an update from the original TEL document, the Teacher Effectiveness for Language Learning Framework, that was originally published in 2014. So what I'm going to do is put links in the chat box. And this is our second official activity for today. Our first activities were the poll questions, but now I want you to go ahead and download this handout for our broadcast today. You've got 3 options. You can download a copy for yourself either from the chat box, just use that first link. It's the PDF version in our Google Drive, and then you can pop it up on your desktop as you need to. You can also go over to the World Language Webinar Series webpage and get a copy of this particular TEL document as well as the others. Or you can go directly to the TEL Framework webpage that you see in the chat box and get it there. Either way, it's accessible for you. So download a copy for yourself and go ahead and skim the 7 lettered sub-criteria for this session's focus. So there's quite a bit to go over. I'll pause for a moment while you do that. Download that and start looking over LE3. All right, I hope you've had a chance to pull the TELX Learning Experience domain document up so you can look at that and clearly see everything that's in LE3. There are a lot of statements for LE3, but we'll be going over them one by one as well. So let's start this part of the broadcast by reflecting on implementing LE3 with our North Carolina World Language Essential Standards. Obviously, we know LE3 supports our World Language Essential Standards, but we need to take a closer look at how that actually works so that you can think about and reflect on what that looks like in your particular classroom or classrooms that you go into if you're an administrator. All right, so let's look at these sub-criteria. The first one, and they're all lettered, so A, is the teacher ensures that at least 90% of what is shared with students is in the target language. Of course, we know that this best practice of being in the target language 90% of the time or more is something we all are working on every day. But I want you to think for a moment how that actually looks in your classroom. And don't forget the things not only that you say or do with students, but how your classroom is designed. Where can they see the target language when they come into your classroom or into your learning space, even if that's online or in some sort of hybrid format? B continues that by saying the teacher minimizes the use of English by carefully and deliberately determining when and if it is necessary. There are a number of world language teachers who believe it's never necessary to use English because their students have been taught the routines and so forth and are used to using the target language so that they don't even need to use English. Some world language teachers would say it might be necessary to use English in the case of an emergency. Maybe there's a fire drill or a fire alarm or something like that, and you want to switch to English quickly because of the nature of that. But again, one of the goals is to minimize the use of English by being very careful and deliberate about your planning and thinking of it. C is the teacher uses a variety of verbal and nonverbal strategies to make language comprehensible. We're always trying to make language comprehensible to students, and we want to do what we call C+1. So give them comprehensible input that pushes them just a little bit to make sure that they're drawing on all of their skills, verbal and nonverbal strategies that you're sharing with them, as well as things that you're doing in the classroom to support their learning. D is the teacher uses a variety of strategies to allow students to monitor their comprehension. So it's not just about what the teacher does, but in fact, what the students do and are allowed to do and are encouraged to do to monitor their own comprehension as it says, but to also build their skills in the language that they're learning. E is the teacher facilitates activities that allow students to interpret, analyze, and interact with authentic materials. So consider that for a moment because we want them to interpret. It's the interpretive standard, of course, so that's obvious. We want them to analyze. We want them to put a keen eye and use their critical thinking skills on the things that they see and read and hear in our classrooms. And we always want them to be interacting with authentic materials. Those are materials that are designed for native speakers of the language. And of course, in our 21st century world with technology, it's a lot easier now to get those authentic materials than it used to be, which is a great benefit. But it's also a challenge because we want to make sure we're using authentic materials that are appropriate for the proficiency level of our students that pushes them to make sure they can comprehend what they're looking at, but also pushes them just a little bit to go beyond where they're currently at and start building their proficiency higher. F is the teacher uses a variety of strategies to frequently check that students understand the message of written and spoken text. And we could even say signed text, of course, in American Sign Language. But again, this is looking at a variety. Notice a lot of these statements talk about a variety of strategies that are being used. And in this case, to do those formative assessment quick checks or checks for understanding to make sure students are comprehending what it is they're learning and interpreting in your classroom. And finally, G. The teacher ensures students have sufficient time to process in that interpretive mode before producing language. We know as world language specialists that it is easier to work on the receptive skills, those things that you hear, you see, or you read. before you start producing any language that you might have to speak or sign or present in some fashion. So that's important to consider because everyone needs time to process. We've always talked about, of course, wait time in our methodology courses. How do you do that in a world language classroom? How does it work best? And I'm sure you have a lot of tips and tricks. And so we're going to be talking about those today and asking you to reflect on those, and also hearing from our model world language teachers about what they do in their classrooms to ensure that they're using these sub-criteria with LE3 to really focus on implementing the interpretive standard in our work. All right, well, having said all of that, we're up to our next poll question. So what I want you to do is answer this question. When you think about your teaching in the classroom or in your learning space if you're online, and how your students learn, whatever age they are, elementary, middle school, high school, maybe post-secondary, which of the sub-criteria are most important for implementing the state standards? Now you can choose up to 3 of the 7. Of course, they're all important, but for you personally in your teaching with your students, I want you to think about which 3 are most important for implementing the state standards. I'm going to open this question, and we have a little bit more time to respond, about 2 minutes, so that you can kind of consider this and kind of reflect on which 3 are most important for you. And you don't have to do 3 total, just be up to 3. All right, it's in your control panel. Please go ahead and start putting your responses in when you're ready. All right, there's about 30 seconds to get your responses in. You can choose up to 3 of these sub-criteria. All right, great. I'm going to go ahead and show the poll results, so they should come up in your control panel. But instead of talking about the poll results like we did before, I'm going to just put them there for you to review. And we're going to hear from our modern world language teachers about what they think the most important sub-criteria are for them and their students in the classroom, to get some perspective on that and to think more deeply about our own answers to this question. I do have them lined up in alphabetical order, so Alexa is first. Alexa, tell us about, when you think about your teaching and how your students learn, which of these sub-criteria are most important for implementing the state standards?
So I teach virtually, and it's all virtual. And so I looked at this a little different, and also I saw what some of the other co-presenters today said, and I didn't want to say the exact same thing as them, although we probably will. But I chose E, F, and G. I think that now with the ability to use YouTube, whether you're allowed to use YouTube as it is, or if you can ingest it into something else that is more friendly for the students and schools to be able to access. That really has opened up a way for us to get materials that we didn't used to be able to get as easily. And so what I really enjoy doing is using Canvas Studio, since I'm online, but I've also used Edpuzzle or ThingLink or Nearpod, but most of the time now I use Canvas Studio because it lets me find a YouTube video that is out there, and then I can bring it into Canvas so the students aren't going to YouTube, and then I can have different points in the video where it asks comprehension questions. And so that allows the students to, and that goes with F also, it allows the students to check that they're understanding because they're able to have those questions and those stopping points to get them to stop. But what's also important is before even getting to that, and this goes with G, is that in order for them to have time to process, they need to make sure that they're understanding it. So doing some kind of pre-reading or pre-listening activity, and then as they're doing the activity, having the multiple checks built in, and then afterwards letting them do some kind of reflection or thinking where they don't have to produce, they can just show that they understand before getting to the producing. And so with all of the assessments that I do in the interpretive mode, in addition to having the Canvas Studio and the questions throughout, I have a word wall that is linked, and so the students can access that word wall so that they get the vocabulary specifically to help them. They get the prompting, the sentence frame starters that they might need so that they know that they know how to say I agree, but maybe they don't remember that, and that wasn't what I was assessing. I wanted to know what they could do with it, so giving them the supports they need. And so in the virtual world, it's a lot of things where I'm using a tool and then building on it. And so within an assignment, have the link to a pre-activity, having the Canvas Studio with the questions built in, and then having the link to the word wall to get them processing and ready before they move on. So that was my little tidbit.
Great. I'm going to look too just briefly, and I'll do this at the end of each presenter's overview to see if there's any questions in the chat box that you have, in this case for Alexa. I do notice that E, F, and G that Alexa talked to us about are also popular choices for you in our poll. So take a look too at that. Consider that we have about a third, on almost each one, who said that that's a sub-criteria that's very important for implementing our state standards. All right, well, we'll keep an eye out for questions. And again, you can always ask questions of any or all of our presenters. It's up to you. Thank you so much, Alexa, for sharing your perspective on this particular criteria. Next, we'll move to Carmen.
All right. So I chose very similar ones to Alexa. I chose D, E, and G. And first of all, before we get into this, I want to say that I love how you, Emery, are using the TEL framework because it really lets you self-reflect. If you guys are out there and you're part of a PLC or PLT or professional learning, whatever, I challenge you to use the self-assessments with your departments, because we did this last spring, and we could analyze where we thought we were, and then we could talk about how we can make ourselves stronger and better as a team. So that was really a cool idea. So I love this. So let me just start with D. The teacher uses a variety of strategies. I teach very, very novice learners. And so I probably do use a little more English than some of you who teach the upper levels. And one of the things I do actually allow my students to do in English is to set a weekly language goal. So I give them our I can statements for the week, our big umbrella of what we're going to do. They set a weekly language goal every Monday. They talk about how they're going to try to meet that goal. And then on Fridays, we reflect on that goal. Did they meet the goal? So it's not necessarily interpretive, but it's the fact that I'm already setting them up for success for the week, because they have to think ahead of what's coming. And then at the end of the week, they're like, yes, just try to use this. Has helped me. This is what I still want to work on. So I'm a big advocate of students monitoring their own language comprehension, not necessarily throughout just each lesson, but in terms of what we're doing each week. But I really want to focus on E, because I think this is where I have grown myself in probably the past 10 years. And I think all of us just want to be better teachers, and we want to be better language facilitators for our students, because that's really what we are. And so I have to say that if any of you guys know me out there, I'm kind of crazy, and I'm department chair, and I always have these ideas, and I love to stay fresh. And so I said, all right, we've been through a lot in the last year and a half. Why don't we just keep making things really hard for ourselves? So this year we are implementing new themes for our first 2 levels of language that we designed. So we aren't doing a separate family and home unit anymore. We're not doing a separate food unit anymore. So again, I promise I'm getting to the interpretive piece here, but we're doing big themes like curiosity, identity, activity, community. And so we're able to recycle and spiral things throughout each of these, which has really helped us. And I'll say, your best friend is authentic resources. And like Amory said, we live in such a time where we don't have to rely on, thank you, we don't have to rely on what's in our textbook. They're awesome resources, we know that, but there's so much out there just to see what's out there and to search for things. And so we use things in our department like infographics, of course, videos, like Alexa mentioned, commercials, advertisements, animated shorts. Okay, bear with me. We use TikTok videos now that we vetted, of course, tweets, Instagram posts, everything that's live and real in the Spanish-speaking world, since I teach Spanish. A couple of examples, we might use a video. Now, like I said, I teach novice, low to mid to high students. We might use, I have a Coca-Cola video that I found that's about prejudices and stereotypes. Well, my level 1 students aren't able to, they don't have the language to talk about all those things, but what they do have the language to do is to watch the video, let me pause it at certain intervals, and to talk about their first impression, their second impression, or whatever I'm asking them to do in the target language. It's easy for them, and they're using words that they know, like descriptive words, like adjectives or cognates or anything that they can. And so that's how I try to modify the task, since I can't modify the text. That's the key phrase with interpretive authentic resources. And that's one of the things I've had a lot of success with. Alexa mentioned using the Canvas, what's it called? The Canvas Studio. And I use Edpuzzle, which is very similar. You bring in an authentic video and you can embed questions. And sometimes what I like to do, which for me is more fun, is to leave it open-ended. So they're still having to interpret what's happening. And then I let them produce the language that they can. So then it becomes a little bit more presentational, but they're still able to handle certain things like that. In thinking of our new themes, we wanted to focus on intrinsic motivation or motivation in general. What motivates our Gen Z learners? We want to focus on growth mindset and what interests our students in the first place. So that's why we turned to their world a little bit, the TikToks and the Instagram posts and whatever. But by far, infographics are our favorite things in the world, okay? Because the language is usually fairly basic. They're usually images, there's some data, they have to interpret nonfiction text, which are skills that they're going to be able to use later in AP or upper level classes, or even in just their regular core classes that they have every day. We might ask them to highlight certain things or direct their attention to a specific part of the infographic. So that, it works out so well. And we do similar things over and over again so that students know what to do without me having to use any English, because they see the infographic, they look for my question, and then they know exactly what to do. We used infographics that talked about how your favorite color relates to your personality. Again, with our identity unit, they knew those descriptive words. Digital identity, social media, sports infographics, the benefits of staying healthy, a healthy lifestyle, reading food labels. I mean, just all kinds of things that before we might have done all isolated in one specific unit for that topic, but now we're just constantly recycling them and spiraling them throughout the whole semester. And we have seen such progress with our students, what they're able to produce. And that's the G part, right? Processing time. So we give them all these things that they see and they read and they listen to, then we ask them to produce, much like you would a child. I have a 19-month-old precious niece, and she's just taking it all in. And finally, she's starting to produce because she's heard it enough times. And of course, when I'm using the language with the classroom, I'm using visuals and gestures and really acting a lot as I try to stay in the target language as much as possible. But speaking of G, because I know my time's just about up, that again, we expose students to all these things through the infographics or the videos or whatever interpretive text. We even use authentic images to teach numbers now. We just find real images. Why just flash a picture of Uno up there when I can find a real like house sign with the numbers on it that I want us to talk about? So just keeping the target language culture, this is where the interculturality piece comes in, keeping that as alive in your classes as possible. And then again, like I said, that leads to processing time in part in letter G. So we might give them sentence starters. We might give them a little bit of support. We might provide a model or an example for them. And as I mentioned, we do lots of scaffolding and spiraling and front loading so that students are more successful when they begin to produce. So I hope those things helped you. And I'm happy if anyone wants to email me, I can tell you some of the things that we've been doing in more detail. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Carmen. And once again, we'll pause for a moment, see if anyone has any questions for Carmen about what she's shared. Do take a look too. She's indicated D, E, and G as being important for implementing our state standards, and take a look at how many of you here today on the poll question indicated those are professional strengths for you and you consider them important as well. Carmen, we do have a question for you, and this might apply to our other guest speakers as well. Could you share your Twitter tag so that they could follow you and all the great ideas that you're posting on Twitter
Sure.
and other social media?
Of course, of course. I'm not the best tweeter, but I use it a lot. But I'm happy, yeah. And I'll put my email in there too, because we have really curated so many fabulous resources this semester. I'm so proud of my department and my team. So yeah, I'll put that in the chat. Thank you.
Great. All right. Well, Carmen will post that for us, and we'll go ahead and move on to Thomas.
Thank you, everyone. So if you can see what I put up there, I thought I'd kind of give a little bit of structure here. I'm going to talk about the why for my choices, and then I'm going to talk about the how, and then I'm going to give a couple examples. So that first bit there is to ensure that teachers are using at least 90% of what they share with students in the target language. And I always say, like, and it's not saying to try to do the entire class 100%, but if you shoot for 100%, you'll probably make 90. So that's always a good idea, because we want our students to hear a lot. And if it's our voice that they hear all the time, and it's not in the target language, well, then they're losing that input time. So we want to give them as much input time as possible. So maybe somebody says, well, at times I might need to help my students. Well, then you have that emergency, or if a kid says some sort of vocabulary word that you know it's going to take 5 minutes to explain, you might want to say some English. But if not, if you don't hear it all the time from authentic resources, and they leave your classroom and then they hear somebody, maybe a friend of theirs, speaking Spanish, and they don't understand, they may think that what's happening in class is not relevant to actually how Spanish is spoken outside of the classroom. So we want to make it relevant to the students, so what they hear and do in the classroom is the same as what they might encounter outside of the classroom. And then we have, of course, we want to make it comprehensible, because they need those verbal and nonverbal cues to understand. And brain-based research shows that having verbal and nonverbal cues when students are learning a language, that they are more likely to take it in and put it into long-term memory. And also, I want to have that 90% of the language, but if students don't understand, they get bored, they get disruptive, and they tune out. And again, that's another reason that they might not want to go on to the second, third, fourth, or fifth level. So we want those students to understand enough to feel like, oh, I'm getting it. I can go on to that next level. And also, we want classes where the students will behave and interact with others well in the language. And then we want to have activities that students interpret and analyze, because we want it to be motivating by being real. If we are using authentic resources that we pulled off the internet the last month, and the kids see it and be like, oh, these are pictures from nowadays. Oh, I can recognize those political figures. I can't name who they are, but I've seen images of them. And wow, this actually uses current language. You know, you might want to, you know, some textbooks are good, but some of the vocabulary, you might look down there and say, ooh, that's a cassette recorder in the vocabulary. That's interesting. So there's those whys, but when you put it in the how, the first bit is if I want to put those three statements together, and I want to say, we want to use 90% and more of the target language in your class by helping students interact with authentic materials by using verbal and nonverbal strategies to aid comprehension. So I see those three as all coming together. We want students to be comfortable with listening, comfortable with hearing. And I'll give an example of how you can get a student to turn off by not understanding. I am not a Russian speaker. If I did not have subtitles for a Russian movie, I just couldn't deal with it. But if I get the subtitles in English, I'm going to sit and watch it. Learning French, but I'm not good at French. So if I put the subtitles in French, then maybe I can understand a little bit more of that movie, maybe if I slow it down. So the why, the how is what we can do with our students and ourselves. The teacher using that 90%, be comfortable with speaking with your students. Be comfortable with yourself making mistakes. Know that that happens and it's just fine. Learn to laugh with your students. Use as many visuals as possible, because those visuals are going to help connect vocabulary to your students' long-term memory more than just hearing it or studying a list of words. And you can prepare your students for videos. Well, I think Alexa was really talking about that, the idea of like pre-reading, and I think it's also like that previewing strategies that we would give students, and I'm going to give a couple examples of that. So the first example I would like to talk about is like just talking about the environment. Most teachers at most levels will talk about the environment in some way or factor in their world language class. Well, think about it. How would you preview for questions you want to answer? Maybe some of the questions you have at a novice level are, what are some environmental problems? Why is there so much trash? How do we solve these problems? And so we have those questions, and wow, isn't it easy to find infographics? You just go into Google Images and you write infographics, and then you type in the exact same question you just answered, and voila, you've got like tons of images that you can already use for the next day in class. All right, so you've got some infographics, maybe you've got some articles, but if you're working with novice students, those infographics are great visual connections to the vocabulary you're teaching. But maybe you start the class with asking those 3 questions out and having students answer to their partner in that low stress situation in Spanish with, what are some environmental problems? Maybe your novice students are just putting out a list. Why do we have so much trash? How do we solve these problems, or how do we fix these problems? And then we show infographics to say that answers, what are some environmental problems? And then you're going to see infographics like, where in the world and what type of problems do we have? And students can write down, like, you can be like, oh, at the end of class, you will have a short conversation where you will answer questions and record answers, and the students will be like, oh, I can write down this and I can use it later. Sure, yeah, that's fine. why do we have so much trash? So you use the infographics. You've done the pre-reading strategy by having the students converse with their partner about the questions, because maybe you asked out there and said, why do we have so much trash? And there was like, I wasn't here yesterday. What's trash? And the other student's like, well, I saw that we did that little Quizlet and I saw this trash and there's this picture that looks like a bunch of basura. So they made a connection. And then finally, you have that end, you read the article or you see the infographics, and then you have the small performance assessment, and the students have analyzed the data on the infographics, right? So and it's been interacting with authentic material. They've had a interpersonal as well as a interpretive activity that they went through during class. So there's an idea for the environment. I found this week with my students working on the environment, an article that was a written script of an interview. And we had the interviewer and the interviewee that was a environmentalist. And all I did was I took those 7 questions that were for the interview and I posed those to the class first to answer to each other. Then they read the article, summarized how the doctor had answered those questions. And then we went back and we did that small assessment where I went back and I asked them the questions as I was the interviewer and they were the interviewee. And after having gone through that article, they could answer those questions in a much more profound way. And then another way, you might think about how would you work with literature. And a lot of people have read a book called The House on Mango Street. And there's a short excerpt where a student or a child says, I don't like my name. And she explains all the reason why she doesn't like her name and why it makes her sad. And she has problems because the teachers mispronounce it at school. And it was her grandmother's name, but her grandmother was kind of like kept inside all of her life. Well, there was an idea like the students had to list out why this person didn't like their name. And then at the end, a small performance assessment was to have a conversation trying to convince their father to let her change her name. And those are just ideas of like, how do we, using that 90%, by getting to 90% by using authentic materials and then finding verbal and nonverbal strategies in comprehension. And I think Carmen had the idea of like really looking at those infographics by saying, these are things that students can see right away and use well. Alexa has that idea of like, we really need to give those pre-reading or pre-viewing strategies. I would like to say when you're showing videos, to add on to Carmen, is that how great is it that you can change the speed of authentic material that you post from a YouTube video. The kid's like, that's so fast. I'm like, oh, you want me to change that to 0.75 speed? And the kid's like, oh, thank you. Well, that's fine to do, and that helps you maintain that 90% target. So anyway, hopefully I wasn't too confusing and then it kind of laid out, but thank you very much for listening to me and good luck with the rest of the week.
Yeah, thank you so much, Thomas. And I think you win today for the most quotable comment about be motivating by being real. And, you know, many of the things you and Carmen and Alexis said have to do with that. Think about how you can be real with your students, make that connection, let them know you make mistakes too, and that, you know, you struggle in your own language learning and with other things as well. Be that example. We've also got a couple of other great comments and some questions. Carmen reminded us all about SMART goals and how important that is, and goal setting in general with our students. And she gave a really good example of that in her discussion. We also have a note from her that says very often that interpretive mode, whatever you're doing in the interpretive mode for standard 2, leads to an interpersonal task for standard number 1. So that's something to keep in mind too. Oftentimes what we're doing in the classroom isn't solely focused on one standard alone, but in fact overlaps with the others and naturally leads to tasks and activities in other areas. And finally, we have a quick question that somebody had about comprehensible input based on some examples that were given here. They said, if we're watching a movie in Spanish and we put the subtitles in Spanish, is it double comprehensible input? I don't know. That's a good question, especially when we think about the interpretive mode where we're reading and listening and viewing. All right. Well, I'm conscious of our time. Oh, I had somebody who said they want to repeat the question. So the question somebody asked, Luis, asked was, if you're watching a movie in Spanish with your students and the subtitles are also in Spanish that they're reading, is that double comprehensible input for an authentic material? It's an interesting question. All right.
I would say that I would say that largely that's scaffolding. Mostly because if I'm concentrating on the reading, I'm probably not I'm not engaged in hearing as well. And if I'm really hearing, I probably won't be reading too much. But it definitely is an aid for we're trying to meet our students where they're at. If their reading is a little bit better and they can't keep up and with the listening, that either way, I mean, we're just trying to help our students rather than make them tune out.
Right. And Carmen said she agrees with that. I'm seeing several comments of people agreeing with that statement and saying that that reinforces the input and makes connections from reading and what it sounds like, at least in Spanish in this particular example. So Cecilia also noted that Spanish is a very phonetic language, so that makes listening as well as reading somewhat different. So that's a unique aspect of Spanish when teaching a world language. All right. Well, I'm conscious of our time, so thank you to all three of our guest presenters today, Thomas, Carmen, and Alexa. We appreciate you sharing your insights with us. One thing I'm going to do as we're closing out today, and you'll have time to do this, you don't have to run off, but is to ask you what evidence you find of LE3 in your own world language classrooms, K-12. So we've talked about this sub-criteria now. And we've talked about what teachers and students actually do in the classroom to show evidence of that LE3 subcriteria. I've also left up on your control panel our last poll and the responses where people were picking out the criteria that they felt were most important in implementing the standards. So when you look at the verbs of our criteria, that's really where the action is, obviously. And I want you to think about that for this closing activity we have. So we're going to do a waterfall in the chat. Some of you know this is flood the chat, but we choose waterfall. But it's where you're going to get to share your response in the chat box, but don't click and share it with everyone until we say go. So specifically what I want you to do is in the chat box, type the letter of one subcriteria that you think is important in implementing our World Language Essential Standards, or WLES. So you chose some beforehand. You've heard about the different ones from the perspective of our guest speakers. Just choose one, type that letter in the chat box that you think is important, and then in 15 words or less, explain why you think that particular subcriteria is critical for our state standards. Maybe you've had something on your mind you've been thinking about while we've been talking this afternoon. Maybe something one of our guest presenters talked about spurred you to think about something differently or consider something in your classroom, maybe from a different angle or perspective. But in 15 words or less, explain why you think that subcriteria is critical. And then when I say the magic word, you'll click enter and we'll see a waterfall of responses. So I'm going to pause here for just a moment because what we're going to do is go ahead and put responses in the chat box. We won't do the waterfall just yet. We'll close out our last few activities and then we'll do the waterfall right at the end. All right. Well, go ahead and continue to work on your responses. I've not said the word yet, but I'm going to close out some other things for us. This is our wrap up and reminders. One thing to know is that we always sign everyone up who registers for a webinar for our World Language Instructors listserv in case you're not already signed up. But you can actually go and sign up for any of the listservs you would like from NCDPI, whether it's a World Language listserv like our World Language Education News, or the DLI Educators, or the NC Linguafolio listserv. I'll put that link in the chat box in case you need that. There are many others as well. Some of you probably work with English learners like in ESL classes, or you may work in content areas in different ways and be dually certified. So there's lots of information you can get in newsletters and announcements from DPI. This is part 2, as I said, of our portion of the series that focuses on LE3. So you see that the first one was on November 3rd, and this is today, December 1st. As I said at the beginning, our materials and recording from each webinar are posted as archives, so you can use those for local professional development or your own use. And the archives also will be available for a period of time and can be completed asynchronously. So if you're listening to this recording, or you want to pass this along to a colleague to have them listen to what our broadcast included today, and then complete our exit ticket for part 2, they can do that and still get credit. Our World Language Webinar series does continue with parts 1 and 2 for the other subcriteria you see here, LE4, LE5, and PF1. So we're continuing to focus on the learning experience TEL domain, as well as the performance and feedback one. I'm going to go ahead and put the link in there, our chat box, where all of our World Language Webinar series information is posted. So you can sign up for any of those upcoming webinars, get those on your calendar, and join us in the new year. This is the last broadcast for 2021 in this particular series, the World Language Webinar series, but there'll be many more coming. As I promised at the beginning, for active participation in today's broadcast, you do get a CEU certificate or a contact hour certificate. Be sure for everyone, districts and charter schools, that you get approval for your professional development in all formats. As I said before, the contact hour will come in the form of an email with an attached certificate of attendance approximately 1 week from today. We do have to process some things on our participation reports and then get that information sent out so we can send you certificates. And then, like I said, the archives will be available too. That's it. This is our NCDPI World Languages team. You've got my email, of course, and phone number, as well as our Google site and my Twitter handle. Look for us on Twitter at #WorldLanguageWednesdays. And also my section chief is here, my supervisor. She's over English language arts and all of languages, so world languages as well as ESL. And then Teresa Parker is our administrative specialist. She's the one who'll send you the email with your certificate. All right, well, having said all that, it's time for our waterfall. So I'm going to go back a few slides and ask you to go ahead and put your responses to this question into the chat if you haven't already, so everyone can see them. I hope you're able to share them with everyone. We tried to set the settings up so you could do that. But as we're closing out, I'll go ahead and share ones that you can't see because they were sent only to the host. So you see, in addition to the ones you can see, we had someone indicate subcriteria A, and they say that's important to immerse the student in the target language and create an environment where the student can acquire the language. Great. Also, we had someone choose F, and they said it's important because making sure students are understanding their content so they can use it is critical to them learning a language. All right, you can see the other ones as well coming up. E is a big focus for a lot of people, particularly with the idea of authentic text. And we've heard so many good ideas today about how to use authentic text, where to find them, which ones to choose for our novice level language learners. That's always a question we all have, right? When a student doesn't have much language yet, how can we support their language and scaffold things so that they continue to build their proficiency? You see a couple of comments too. where people are talking about different criteria and how, for example, you want to relate this to students and help them understand that things like interpreting, analyzing, and interacting skills are just important life skills in general. We also heard a little bit about goal setting in the same way today. Teaching students to set goals and realize when they've accomplished them is something they can take right out of our classrooms and into any aspect of their life, whether it's another classroom or their own personal life. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you learned something that you can use in your classroom right away. It certainly has been an interesting year for us at a week, a very busy week. It seems like it's a rush after Thanksgiving. As we close out the year, some of you are closing out the semester. So we thank everyone for being here. It's such a busy time of the year. I've put my contact information into the chat box if you need that. If you ever want to reach out to me in any way, I'd encourage you to do that. Also, again, I'd like to thank our guest speakers who joined us today and shared from their own classroom experience how to implement the idea of this LE3 subcriteria and really look at interpretive communication and what that means for our students in the classroom, whether they're beginners or more intermediate learners or even moving to advanced levels. So many congratulations to you, and thank you to everyone for joining us. I hope you have a great evening, and look for our materials to be posted within about a week of this broadcast. Thanks so much for joining us.